All right, let's dive into clarity today because there's a lot happening now that it has moved out of the banking committee. And we're going to break all that down for you. We have a special guest coming over from the Solana Policy Institute. Let's just get started. I do want to thank our sponsor today, and that is Tangem. If you guys are looking at self-custody, and you probably should be, at least if you're new to crypto, this is one of your checklist items that you need to put on your checklist, and that is getting into self-custody, which is where you guys get to control where all your assets reside. That means you're in full control, not anybody else. So true ownership, it's very easy to set up and use, super secure, and this is one of the best platforms out there I've seen. We've looked at so many. Tangem, use our link down below. It's going to get you guys going. I think you will like it. It definitely will help. Hey, listen, we're going to bring in Kristen Smith, who is the president at the Solana Policy Institute today. How are you, Kristen?
Good morning, Paul. Great to be here and very excited about the developments this week.
Listen, it was a big week yesterday, pretty much a rapid fire of amendments. And then, of course, those amendments pretty much were, I don't know if they were shot down, but they were somewhat ignored coming out of the Senate. And maybe there were some deals that were made to kind of get into that. Just to kind of get people going, I'll give you guys a few things. This was a few interesting developments and reactions from yesterday. This was Amanda Fisher. She was talking about the issue around, I just don't get it. The industry spent years saying crypto didn't fall within the SEC's jurisdiction. Now we're seeing this kind of spin. You look at that. You also look at the ABA, which of course moved directly into doubling down on statements around what to do in terms of advancing the Clarity Act. And of course, it all centers around that right there, which is stablecoin yield, guys. So you guys know this. Generating rewards is the sticking point for the ABA. So it's going to be a big one. What do you consider as bipartisan right now, Kristen?
Yeah, well, I think as a technical measure, anytime you have legislation where there are either co-sponsors or votes where you have at least one senator from both sides of the aisle, that is technically considered bipartisan. But
Hmm.
the real threshold here with the Clarity Act is we need 60 votes to get it out of the Senate.
Right.
And there are 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents. And so, depending on if all the Republicans vote or not, you're going to need at least another 7. And so I think, as, we look at this legislation, we want it to be bipartisan because it has to be bipartisan, but also the bills that are bipartisan tend to have more staying power. They aren't revisited anytime soon. Like they're really like the best negotiated deals because you have inputs from all sides of of kind of the political spectrum. And so,
Right.
our hope is that I think, listen, going into the markup yesterday, there it was a lot of nervousness around whether or not we would have Democrats join the Republicans. It
Hmm.
was clear we had all the Republican votes, but it was a question of whether or not we would get the additional Democratic senators to join. That did happen, and that means that this bill has a much, much greater chance of getting floor time on the Senate floor. If it had been just a straight partisan line, it might not have had the momentum needed to finish the process. So I'm incredibly pleased that Senators Gallego and Senators Alsobrooks joined with the Republicans to get this bill out of committee and to the next phase, because if that had not happened this week, it would have been very, very difficult. It starts to get very difficult to have enough time to complete the process before the end of the year. So very, very excited that we reached this critical milestone.
Well, we're going to talk about timing here because this is going to get very, I think, very dire if we don't get things moving quickly. You mentioned Gallego and also Brooks. Others that we're concerned about, obviously, Masto is in the hunt in terms of being able to turn into a yes vote. But with Gallego and also Brooks, they did have a statement yesterday that kind of gave them an out. Yes, they were voting to get this through the committee, but it did kind of position it. Do you think they'll end up rug pulling us? I feel like, is
Yeah,
there
no,
something
listen,
they're playing here?
no, I certainly hope they don't rug pull us. Obviously, each vote is an independent vote, and senators, it's their prerogative to vote how they want. But I think that there's been a lot of time and effort, both in the House, with the Senate, with the White House, that
Hmm.
has gone into this bill. And I think that, people they have skin in the game. They've spent hours and hours and hours negotiating this. And so it is my hope that, they don't rug pull. Listen, like we've do this all the time, right? At Solana Policy Institute, when I was at the Blockchain Association, you want to preserve your optionality to continue to
Right.
negotiate. And so oftentimes support at one stage, doesn't necessarily mean support all the way through the process. So no, but listen, I think that these senators, I wasn't in the room, but my colleagues were in the room. We sort of divided and conquered
Hmm.
yesterday. And the thing that I don't think was apparent from viewing it versus being in the room is that negotiations were happening on this bill up to the very last minute. I think both the Republicans and the Democrats knew that if we wanted to keep this bill moving forward, like there had to be some bipartisan support coming out of committee. And so, there was a tremendous amount of activity in the room. I think, the fact that there was this recognition that it needed to be bipartisan to increase its chances was good. I think that, the Republicans gave some concessions in order to get Gallego and also Brooks's votes at this time. And I think that, but I think it
Okay.
just shows that they're committed to finding a pathway forward and, getting this to the Senate floor as quickly
Yeah.
as possible.
All right. You just mentioned something there that the Republicans may have given some concessions. What would you think that concessions have been given so far in
Yeah,
terms of just your opinion?
yeah, no, I think that there was one issue that I think we need to continue to work on as an industry, but this had to deal with sections 301 and 604. And for those of
Hmm.
you who don't live in legislative bill text all the time, this is the relationship between sort of the rulemaking for sort of non-decentralized systems and the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, which are the developer
Yeah.
protections. And so there were a couple changes made to those sections, but there were also some changes related to bank permissibility, to tokenization, to insider trading, to customer protections. These were sort of the bipartisan series of amendments that were passed. And I think, it was very exciting to hear Senator Gallego when he first said that he planned to support for it. I think there was a real sort of sense of relief and excitement amongst those of us watching, because it did show that there was a pathway forward on a
Interesting.
bipartisan basis. And so very, very exciting, very dramatic markup and a lot of activity being negotiated directly in the room.
You look at what Sander was talking about. He's the one of the reporters over at Decrypt, and he mentioned also Brooks kind of holding on to this whole issue around ethics, which we've talked about quite a bit. But this is one of the things that we are concerned about, that this could become another sticking point in terms of negotiations that are happening right now. We'll get into timing in a second. Obviously, ethics are going to be a big part of this. Where do you think the line will get drawn? Do you guys have any opinion on what you think is going to come out of it?
I think it's an interesting issue because this is legislation about regulating different participants in the crypto space. The ethics is not really regulation of crypto; it's
Mhm.
regulation and obligations that apply to government employees, all the way up, from the president down to the interns, right? And
Yeah.
so this is really a politically driven issue. This is about Democrats wanting to hold, President Trump accountable for anything him or his family might be doing with, the crypto space. And so, I do think for the crypto industry, it's a little bit challenging because we're not really a party at this table, right?
Right.
I think the thing that the crypto industry cares about, or at least that we care about at Solana Policy Institute, is we want, like the example I keep using, if we want a senator to go to the floor of the Senate and give a speech celebrating the anniversary of Satoshi's white paper, we don't want, we want them to be able to say the word Bitcoin without them running into an ethics issue, right?
Right.
We want senators to be able to talk about it. And especially as we see tokenization of assets, everything is going to be on crypto rails at some point.
Mhm.
And so we need to make sure that the ethics provision is written in a way where senators can have conversations that aren't being perceived as being like an endorsement of a specific token. And so I think that these conversations are ongoing. I know that there was a lot of work that was done between the Senate Democrats and the White House last week. But this is kind of a funny issue because it doesn't really have anything to do with the core part of the bill. They're definitely, focused on crypto industry assets and activity as opposed to just sort of broader general, Trump has a lot of real estate, for example. There's a lot of industries out there. And so it's a really delicate one. And it's one that I think is not one that the industry is at the table on. But I do think as the bill moves forward and we negotiate and solve some of these other outstanding issues that are there, if the last thing that's left is ethics, I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure both on the White House and the Democrats to find a deal and to attach that and get that done. Because as I said, there's just been thousands and thousands of hours of work that has gone into this legislation, and I think people are going to want to see it across the finish line.
I'm kind of curious now that David Sachs has stepped away from that position. You've got Patrick Witt kind of, I guess, leading the charge there. Who would be, at least in the negotiation side from the administration, that would maybe even get into a debate around ethics?
Well, Patrick Witt is definitely the sort of main negotiator on behalf of the White House, and I think he's been doing a phenomenal job. And for somebody who, a year ago wasn't doing much with crypto policy, it's been really amazing to see how effective he has been. I think that listen, Patrick's going to go have to sell this upwards at the White House, right? When he does have something on paper, and so we wish him good luck in that. But yeah, I do think David Sachs obviously continues to care. He chairs the PCAST, which is the Advisory Committee for Science and Technology. He obviously continues to have a direct line to President Trump and cares deeply about this, but he's not doing the negotiations on a day-to-day basis.
All right, so we have a lot happening additionally with some of other key senators out there. As far as Chuck Schumer, we've had him. He voted against the Genius Act. I'm looking at his page right here over on Stand with Crypto. But he was also on the SAB 121, the Joint House resolution. So that had, some inklings of where we are now with clarity. So my question is, how important is Schumer right now?
No, I think Schumer is very important. Schumer is a little bit interesting in that, I mean, he is a political person, right? Like he operates, everything, looks at everything through a political lens. He is, the majority leader for the Democrats. And so, most of the Democrats are not going to vote for this bill. There's only going to be a handful, maybe a dozen or so, maybe 20 if we're really good. Democrats that will, eventually vote for this bill. And so, he has a duty to kind of his full party and his, ranking member on the Senate Banking Committee, Elizabeth Warren. But he also, very much understands that crypto is an emerging industry. He represents New York. There's a lot of activity going on with the crypto industry and traditional finance. And so, he's looking at this through a lot of different angles. I think that he's been very personally involved. He was making phone calls, to the crypto industry this week. But I think his involvement is critical. Whether or not we get his vote may or may not matter if there are enough votes. But I think having him, kind of push to get something across the finish line, even if he ultimately doesn't vote for it, is very helpful. Like with the Genius Act, he voted against that, but he was, helpful in trying to get, some of the votes. So he's a little bit of a complicated one, and but he's very active at this time, and at least says that he's very committed to moving this forward.
Okay, so obviously there are a lot of key votes here right now. 50. Do you anticipate any of the Republicans defecting?
That's an interesting question. I hope not. Sometimes you might get someone, and I'm not saying that he's going to do this, but just as an example, like a Senator Rand Paul, who's very libertarian, he might look at this and say this is too onerous of regulation for, technology. So you might get somebody like that. I'm not saying that's what he said he's going to do, but
Right.
it's very likely that we will probably lose one or two Republicans, unless it's a really, really tight vote. But we'll have to see, and we'll know more as the bill, kind of moves out of the committee, combines with the agriculture bill and gets
Yeah.
ready for the floor. We'll start to see, if there's any cracks on the Republican side. So yeah, I would expect we lose one or two, but that's why we need, a good number, 10 or
Yeah.
more
Bipartisan.
Democrats to get on this bill.
For sure. I'm looking here at the calendar, Kristen. This, of
Yeah.
course, is, yeah, this is getting tight. So here we are in May. We, of course, are seeing what will be, a holiday coming up in another week. So you've got that laying out right there in late May. Likelihood is people are probably going to be departing, maybe on the 20th or 21st. Along with June not having as much exposure, maybe, or maybe June is going to be the working month. I don't know. And then you only have, 3 weeks in July, and then it's pretty much done outside of 1 week in August before we probably go to midterms. So, in your anticipation, what's the timeline here?
Yeah, well, I think there's a big push going on right now to try to get the Senate to take it up in June. Yes, there is some room that could slip to July, but the floor time really does need to happen this summer because Congress, every year they take the August recess where they go home and they work out of their districts. When you come back in September, there are the Jewish holidays, which limit the number of days that they can vote. And then there are also it's the end of the fiscal year, right? So
Yeah.
the government fiscal year, this is where they're working to pass legislation to keep the government open, to keep the government funded. And so the September floor time is largely accounted for. And then when we move to October, they tend to take that time to go home and get ready for the November election.
Yeah.
And depending on what happens with the election, sometimes that lame duck period in November and December is very productive. Sometimes it's not. It's really hard to know what the political situation is going to be like. So yes, they need to move as quickly as possible. And the Genius Act, if you recall, Paul, was that took about 4 weeks of floor time,
Hmm.
and that is a very long time.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's going to be a big push to get this moving as quickly as possible. And so, I think we're looking to hopefully get that process going by mid-June at the latest.
What's your likelihood right now if you were the Kristen poly market,
Yeah, no,
percentage
I have
wise?
a Kristen poly market every day, and it's all over the place
Yeah.
depending on the latest information. But um, I will say this: I'm probably at about 60% this gets done right now.
Okay.
That is the highest I have been throughout this
Oh,
whole process.
okay.
I think that legislation is really, really hard to do. There are
Mhm.
so many different pieces that need to line up just right. The good news is all of those pieces are there. They're on the board. We have, in theory, everything we need, and now we need to get them all lined up and in a row. And so I'm at about 60% right now. Just 2 weeks ago, I was at 40%.
Oh,
I
okay.
think I had a real turning point when I was interacting with folks down in Miami. We had a really good bipartisan group of senators and congressmen that came down to the Consensus conference and were really actively engaged and being very productive. And so I would say like that the fact that we got through this markup has put that above 60 for me. But there's a lot that could go wrong.
Right.
We don't want a lot to go wrong. We want this to go right. We want to get this done. And I think that's why everyone's working really, really hard because, if this gets bumped into next year, depending on the makeup of the House and the Senate, it might not be as much of a priority for getting this done. So we really need to try to take advantage of this, of the fact that we have so much work done and we have such a willing group of bipartisan senators that want to get it across the finish line.
I was looking at a tweet by Adam Meinhardt. He's coming in
Yeah,
And we just had him on the show.
he's fantastic.
Yeah, he's been in DC for a while, and he had a statement in here that caused me a pause, and it was this statement right here that I highlighted. I don't know if you can see it, but let me zoom in on it for you a little bit. Um, it says, really in reference to Clarity Act, but it boiled down to one thing. Serious work lies ahead on BRCA and ethics. And this is in
Hmm.
reference to the negotiations. So when you think about that and you worry, I look at it and I go, wait a minute, maybe there's some negotiations being done by centralized exchanges as well. Coinbase is going to be one of the biggest ones out here, has been fighting for this in terms of killing DeFi protections as a sacrificial lamb. Do you think, because it's not in their interest, do you think that is possibly underway?
No, I don't think that's underway. I do think the centralized exchanges, and I obviously don't speak for them, but in my conversations with them, they want to be at a gateway for people to get to the DeFi world, and they want to
Mhm.
connect with DeFi. And they have, Coinbase has Base, right? Kraken has their own. I think it's called Ink. I haven't used it, but they have their own.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
they want to be gateways to the DeFi world. And I think that the leadership at those companies, like these are the OGs, right? Like they are not trying to recreate the old financial system with like a fintech wrapper. Like they
Okay.
truly believe that DeFi is really the entire point of crypto. And so I'm not worried about this. This is very different than a couple of years ago when Sam Bankman-Fried was going around with FTX and he was,
Yes,
he
exactly.
actually
Yeah.
did have, I think, very harmful intentions towards DeFi. That is not the case today. And I think that the real source of this and any concerns around DeFi is a misunderstanding by law enforcement and by senators who have strong ties to law enforcement.
Yes.
There have been a lot of conversations trying to get some of the law enforcement groups up to speed on how much that if you look at the entirety of the bill, like this
Mhm.
gives so many new tools for law enforcement and an entire regulatory framework that will help law enforcement catch the criminals. And I think if in isolation without the full context, you look at one little section here and one section there, no, not most people don't read the full bill, right? Like this is a
Yeah. Yeah.
300 plus pages. And so I think we're going to continue to do some work with the law enforcement and try to get them to, sort of back down from this sort of very sort of narrow, often like sort of not factual statements that they're making because they're, I think, a real misunderstanding there that is the biggest threat to something like the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, not the centralized exchanges.
Okay, not that. And really this is kind of goes in line with what Senator Warren has been pushing for. But there's also a handful of others that are out there that have kind of aligned with it. We're starting to identify some interesting people that have not necessarily been in the negotiations before, at least on the Senate side, that could end up on it. So I think we're going to see a few new names. Anybody that you're watching outside of the obvious ones that we know of with Gallegos, also Brooks, Masto, anyone else that you think we need to kind of be on the lookout for?
Yeah, I think Senator Mark Warner from Virginia
Yeah.
is another important one. He also leads up the Senate Intelligence Committee on the
Mhm.
Democratic side, and I think a lot of he's a lot of colleagues, off committee on the Senate floor, I think look to him for how to handle something like this, given his tech background and his intelligence
Yeah.
background. And so I think he's going to be kind of a critical one on the Democratic side that if he gets to a good place, he'll bring several votes along with him.
What about Van Hollen? Do you think he would be
Van
an issue?
Hollen's a potential. Van Hollen's in the mix. I think he's an option. I think if we can get, if we can get a deal, I think it's not going to be a close vote. I think it's going to be
Right.
actually a very strong vote in the
Oh, really?
Senate.
Okay.
I think it's
That's
just
good.
going to be a question of, can we find something that works for the Democrats that
Hmm.
also doesn't overly harm the industry because, if we do start to take away and erode these developer protections and we do make it very burdensome for new startups to operate here in the US, all of a sudden the bill is, not going to be a net positive for the industry. It'll be a net negative. And so it's really important that we keep a couple of these key provisions in there so that developers feel like they can come back to the US and launch their companies, launch their protocols here. Because we think this is, that's the whole point. We're trying to do this law so that we have clarity so that the US can be the leader as we enter this new era of financial technology.
Listen, Senator Warren most likely is going to be the brick wall coming into that, Senate vote. Who would be, because every time I've seen her go head to head with anyone, whether it's Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter, she does a pretty good job at positioning her facts, even though sometimes I don't think the facts are fully disclosed. And we just called that out yesterday in one of our shows. Who could challenge Senator Warren to try to get her on the right side of history here?
She won't. She's
just
impossible.
not going to happen.
Yeah, we've been, before being at Solana Policy Institute, I was the CEO of the Blockchain Association for 7 years. She is not on our side and will never be on our side. And there have been effort after effort, former students trying to appeal to her,
Wow.
People within the crypto industry who are very like-minded politically trying to get out, there have been more efforts to try to get Elizabeth Warren on our side. Because if you think of her, many years ago, you sort of thought of her as being the one that wanted to challenge the big banks, that wanted to, democratize finance. Like she has a lot of values that you think would align with crypto, but it turns out at the end of the day, she just wants the government to have control over everything and all of the information. And she is not here to be constructive. And so it is a lost cause, I think, to get her on board.
There you go. So fight to the end, guys. Last question to you. This obviously comes out of Senate. We're assuming that this is going to get passed through the Senate. It goes to the House. Would this be pretty much a slam dunk over there, similar to Fit 21 vote? Which was
I think so. I think,
okay.
And when the House passed their version of Clarity, it was very bipartisan this year as well. And listen, it is so difficult to get something through the Senate floor that whatever the Senate can get the 60 plus votes to send over to the House, I think the House will probably just pass that. Obviously, as you well know, to get to the president's desk, you have to have identical language approved in the House and the Senate. And so I think it'll very quickly move through the House. And then, hopefully we can be headed back to the White House for another bill signing ceremony this summer.
Wouldn't that be something?
It would be amazing. It would be really historic.
We haven't seen much like this in 30 years, since really the birth of the internet. So Kristen Smith, president at the Solana Policy Institute, thank you so much for coming in today. We appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me, Paul.
If you like this video, hit like and subscribe, drop a comment down below, and also join our free private member group. The link is in the description.